In London, right after he gets there, the Ripper murders begin. And right after he leaves, they stop.
In 1888, a shadow fell over London.
Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah.
Leaving a legacy of terror that lasted 137 years. But now, that shadow finally has a face. The real identity of Jack the Ripper has finally been revealed. And the answer was not in the theories about royalty or famous doctors. It was hiding on a single piece of fabric, a shawl, taken from a victim's body.
DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
Groundbreaking genetic testing has uncovered a name, ending the world's biggest mystery about Jack the Ripper's true face. What science has found on that shawl will change history forever. The shawl that talked. For over 100 years, the mystery of Jack the Ripper seemed unsolvable. But when an old shawl surfaced from the night of the murder, investigators realized it might hold what no witness ever could: the killer's voice. Russell Edwards, a British businessman turned true crime investigator, was obsessed with solving the Ripper case and saw this as his chance. He enlisted the help of Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist, to do what was impossible in 1888: test for genetic evidence. You see, the shawl had visible stains. Some were consistent with crimson stains, but others were different. The team got to work, carefully extracting material from the fragile 100-plus-year-old fabric. This wasn't easy. The risk of contamination from everyone who had handled it over 100 years was massive. But using modern, highly sensitive techniques, they managed to isolate genetic fragments. First, they tested the crimson stains. They tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, the victim. They took a sample and compared the mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. This is a special type of genetic material passed down only from a mother to her children. The result? A perfect match. The stains were, with almost total certainty, from Catherine Eddowes. This proved the shawl was authentic to the crime scene. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Dr. Louhelainen and his team also analyzed the other stains, which they identified as bodily fluid from the attacker. They began a new hunt, this time for descendants of one of the original prime suspects, a man named Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel and was known to be mentally unstable. He was even on the police's radar back in 1888. The team tracked down a living maternal line descendant of Kosminski's sister. They compared the mitochondrial DNA from the shawl's second set of stains to this living relative. The result was another 100% match. After 137 years, science had pointed a finger. The genetic evidence on the only surviving artifact from the crime scene belonged to Aaron Kosminski. For the first time, a real name was tied to the legend, not by theory, but by a genetic thread stretching across time. This wasn't just a clue. It was a revelation that promised to finally identify the man who had terrified the world. But who was this man? And what drove him to commit these acts? The world the Predator knew. To understand the Predator, you must first understand his hunting ground. The London of 1888 was not the city of top hats and tea parties we imagine, at least not in the East End. You see, Whitechapel was what many called the Abyss. It was a sprawling, overcrowded slum packed with over 76,000 people in less than 1 square mile. This was a place of desperation. The air was thick with coal smoke and the stench from tanneries and slaughterhouses. The streets, narrow and winding, were a labyrinth of unlit alleys and dark courtyards. At night, a thick fog would roll in from the River Thames, blanketing everything in a gray, sound-dampening shroud. This was a world of crushing poverty. Thousands lived in doss houses, filthy communal rooms where you could rent a spot on a lice-ridden bed for 4 pence a night. If you couldn't afford that, you paid 2 pence to sleep, leaning against a rope stretched across the room. This is the world the victims inhabited. They weren't just names. They were real women who had fallen on hard times. They were mothers, wives, and daughters. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. History calls them the Canonical Five. These women lived on the absolute margins of society. They often sold matches, flowers, or the only other thing they had left to scrape together those few pennies for a bed and some gin. And this vulnerability is exactly what the attacker preyed on. He knew these streets. He knew these women. He knew they would go with a stranger for the price of a drink, and he knew that in the chaos of Whitechapel, a scream would likely be ignored. He used the fog and darkness as a weapon. The horrific events began on August 31st, 1888, with Mary Ann Nichols. Her body was found in Buck's Row, her throat deeply cut, and her body bearing terrible injuries. Just over a week later, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The attacker had been more brutal. The city began to panic. Then, on September 30th, the double event happened. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard. It seemed the predator was interrupted, as she only had her throat cut. But he wasn't finished. Less than an hour later, the body of Catherine Eddowes, the woman whose shawl would one day solve the mystery, was found in Mitre Square. Her body was horrifically altered, with organs removed. The attacker was escalating. The final act on November 9th was Mary Jane Kelly. She was different. She had her own room, 13 Miller's Court. Here, safe from the streets, the attacker took his time, creating a scene of unbelievable horror that traumatized even the most hardened police officers. And then, he vanished. The predator was gone, leaving a city in terror and a police force in chaos. The hunt for a ghost. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders started in chaos, confused, desperate, and doomed from the very beginning. The police were fighting a war they couldn't even understand. The very idea of a serial attacker was brand new. They had no framework for this. Worse, two separate police forces had jurisdiction. The Metropolitan Police, or the Met, and the City of London Police. They did not like each other and refused to cooperate, hoarding clues and tripping over each other's investigations. The thing nobody tells you is that this rivalry probably let the predator get away. But the biggest problem? Lack of science. In today's world, a detective would have a mountain of evidence. In 1888, they had nothing. The concept of fingerprinting was just being developed and wasn't used. They had no idea how to test for blood types, let alone genetic material. They couldn't lift fibers. The crime scenes were immediately contaminated by crowds, journalists, and even the police themselves. They were, in effect, trying to catch a ghost. Into this vacuum stepped the press. Newspapers were in a frenzy, and many people were crazy about the case. They published sensational, wild theories. And then, a letter arrived. Sent to the Central News Agency, it was written in red ink and mocked the police. It was boastful and chilling. The author promised to keep going and signed it with a name that would echo forever: Jack the Ripper. Most experts today believe this letter was a hoax, probably written by a journalist to sell more papers. But it worked. The public latched onto the name, and the predator became a legend. Hundreds more letters followed, including one sent from hell with half of a human kidney. The police were drowning in tips and false leads. They interviewed thousands of people and arrested hundreds of suspects. Their list was a revolving door of sailors, butchers, doctors, and lunatics, but a few names stuck. The McNaughton Memorandum, a secret police document from 1894, named 3 primary suspects. The first was Montague John Druitt, a barrister who mysteriously ended his own life in the Thames right after the final event. The second was Michael Ostrog, a Russian conman and all-around shady character. And the third, the one who top police officials really believed was their man, was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant who lived right in the heart of Whitechapel, the same narrow, fog-soaked streets where the murders took place. He was known to be deeply mentally unstable, plagued by violent delusions, and filled with a burning hatred toward women. But here's the catch. The police never had enough proof. They had a single witness who reportedly identified him as the killer, yet when it came time to testify, that witness backed out, too afraid, too uncertain, or perhaps pressured into silence. Without that testimony, the police had nothing solid. In 1891, Kosminski was quietly committed to an asylum where he would live out the rest of his life, tormented by voices only he could hear. And then, almost as if someone had flipped a switch, the killings stopped. Whitechapel fell silent. The Ripper vanished. For the detectives of the time, this was no coincidence. They believed they'd found their man, but could never prove it. To them, Kosminski wasn't just a suspect. He was the key that fit too perfectly. A man living at the center of the terror, consumed by madness, was suddenly removed from society right as the nightmare ended. For more than a century, his name lingered in whispers, buried beneath layers of doubt and speculation. But with modern evidence now pointing in his direction, the question returns. Did they actually have their killer all along, locked away in plain sight, while the world searched everywhere else? They just never imagined it would take a shawl, 130 years later, to prove it. Doubt and DNA. The DNA match to Aaron Kosminski seems like a slam dunk. Case closed, mystery solved. But not all things are what they seem. As soon as the findings were published, the scientific community hit back, and they hit back hard. They pointed out some massive problems with the evidence. The first, and biggest, is contamination. That shawl wasn't sealed in an evidence bag in 1888. It was handled by Sergeant Simpson, his wife, and countless descendants for over a century. It was handled by auctioneers and by Russell Edwards himself before testing. Critics argue that any one of those people could have contaminated it. The second problem is the provenance. There is zero official police documentation that mentions this shawl. No evidence log, no report. The only proof that it came from Catherine Eddowes' body is the family story of the Simpsons. While the victim's genetic material on it makes a strong case, the lack of a paper trail is a huge red flag for historians. And the third most scientific problem is the DNA itself. The team used mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. As we said, this is passed down through the maternal line. What this means is the DNA on the shawl would also match Aaron Kosminski's mother, his aunts, his sisters, and all of his maternal cousins. The match doesn't pinpoint Aaron specifically, it just points to his entire family. Critics argue that any one of his relatives who lived in Whitechapel could have been the one who left that trace. So, the conclusive proof starts to look a little shaky. However, the case for Kosminski is still the strongest we've ever had. You see, it's not just the DNA, it's how the DNA lines up with the original police investigation. Aaron Kosminski was the prime suspect for the most senior officers on the case, and the clue to prove this was hiding in plain sight for years. In the 1990s, a copy of the police commissioner's memoir was found. In the margins, the man who led the investigation, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, had handwritten his own notes. And in those notes, he names Kosminski as the man they believed was the perpetrator. He confirms the story that a witness identified him, but that the witness backed out. When you put it all together, the picture becomes terrifyingly clear. You have the highest-ranking police officers at the time, in their private notes, naming one man. You have that same man living at the epicenter of the murders, known to be mentally unstable, and who was quietly institutionalized almost immediately after the killings stopped. And now, more than 137 years later, the only surviving piece of physical evidence, a blood-stained shawl, carries genetic traces that match that exact same man's family. It's a web of connections almost too strong to dismiss as a coincidence. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some theorists suggest that the institutionalization wasn't about mental illness. It was a cover-up. That he may have been part of a secret social circle, perhaps even protected by powerful figures who wanted the case buried. Others go further, claiming the Whitechapel murders were part of a ritualistic pattern designed to echo ancient Masonic or occult symbolism hidden in the layout of the crime scenes. Then there's the time theory. A few believe the murders were so precise, so methodical, that they may have been part of an experiment, either medical or temporal. The idea goes that the killer might have been aided by early psychiatric or even hypnotic techniques, manipulating his victims and vanishing without a trace. Some say that's why no one ever truly caught him, because he wasn't acting alone, or maybe not even from this timeline at all. So, is the mystery finally over? Or is the shawl just another red herring in history's greatest case? Let us know what you believe in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysteries solved. Thanks for watching.